Easter bunnies and eggs are sacred symbols of pagan goddesses, fertility goddesses like Ostara, Yostre, or Ishtar. Therefore, Easter is a fertility cult festival. This is the big accusation making rounds in social media these days. Today's video, I am going to give you a clear-cut rebuttal to that claim. We are also going to look at the real meaning behind the Easter eggs and bunnies and find out how these traditions actually started. This is our fourth video exploring if Easter has any pagan roots. To be honest, this specific accusation doesn't even deserve serious response because it has absolutely no historical foundation. It's literally made up out of thin air. I want to highlight some of the massive factual mistakes buried in these arguments. The entire accusation is built on the false assumption that Easter eggs and bunnies were sacred symbols of goddesses like Yostre or Ishtar in the first place. But there are two major problems with that argument. First off, the idea that Yostre and Ishtar are even the same being or somehow connected to each other is total nonsense. Secondly, there isn't a shred of historical evidence linking either of these goddesses to eggs or rabbits. Actually, it's not just them. You won't find a single pagan deity in all of human history who has a rabbit as their sacred symbol. I am officially laying down a challenge. Show me one ancient image of a god or a goddess where a rabbit is depicted as their sacred symbol. If anyone is brave enough to take me upon that, feel free to drop your evidence in the comments. Like we discussed in our earlier videos, the first time the name Yostre even appears in the history is in the 8th century writings of the Venerable Bede. Fast forward about 1,000 years and you have Jacob Grimm suggesting that if the English had a goddess named Yostre, then the Germanic people must have had their own version too. That's where the name Ostara comes from. It was invented by Jacob Grimm. Let's talk about the scam. The name Easter didn't actually come from this goddess. They basically worked backwards, backformed the goddess's name using Easter as a starting point. The logic is, since the English had a goddess named Yostre and since the German word for Easter is Oster, then there must have been a German goddess named Ostara. They pretty much invented that name Ostara to fit their theory. To put it simply, outside of that one name Yostre, there isn't a single piece of historical or archaeological evidences for these goddesses. Who followed her? When and where did they worship her? What did she even look like? We absolutely have no idea. Claiming that eggs and rabbits were symbols of goddesses, we have zero proof or information, is just a complete work of fiction by some Pentecostal or Protestant groups. Oxford Dictionary of English Folklore states there is no shred of evidence that hares were sacred to Yostre. Now, if you look at the goddess Ishtar, it's a completely different story. We actually have plenty of historical evidence and artwork for her. Archaeological digs have turned up all sorts of ancient statues and depictions of Ishtar. But here is the catch. In not one of these carvings or sculptures you will find a rabbit or egg associated with her. There is absolutely no historical record of rabbit or egg being used as Ishtar's sacred symbol. So, to anyone still pushing these claims, I am issuing the challenge again. Go ahead and show us the proof. Now I have got a few things to say to some of our Muslim friends who claim that eggs and rabbits are Ishtar's sacred symbols and use that to call Easter a pagan holiday. Like I already mentioned, the egg and rabbit were never associated with Ishtar. But do you know what one of her actual symbols was? The Crescent Moon. I think you can see where I am going with this. Yes, the Crescent Moon was a sacred symbol for the sex goddess Ishtar. So who is it that still uses that same crescent moon as their primary religious symbol today? Also, if you are so worried about the names sounding so similar, which word sounds more like Ishtar? It's your Iftar. If you use your own logic, we would have to conclude that Iftar is a pagan ritual conducted in honor of fertility goddess Ishtar. That's just how ridiculous this Easter Ishtar argument really is. Now let's look at the actual history behind the Easter eggs and bunnies. As we all know, the tradition of fasting for 40 or 50 days before Easter is still very much alive today. Back in the day, it wasn't just meant that was off the table. Christians completely gave up eggs and dairy as well. In medieval Europe, they abstained from all animal products. But there was a small problem here. It's no use telling chicken that we are fasting. The chicken will keep laying eggs as usual. Since there were no refrigerators back then like we have today, common people adopted some other preservation techniques, which included hard boiling these eggs. When Easter finally arrived, they would eat those eggs to break their fast. Over time, it became a festive tradition to paint and decorate these preserved eggs. This is a thoroughly Christian tradition. We have clear historical records of this practice dating all the way back to the 13th century. There isn't a single record in history of any pagan religion having a tradition of coloring eggs as part of their worship before this. Of course, egg is a symbol of life and that is true in almost every culture, but that doesn't make the egg pagan. Now let's move on to Easter bunny. Compared to Easter eggs, Easter bunny is a much more modern addition. This folkloric figure is often imagined as a rabbit that delivers Easter eggs. While history isn't exactly clear how this whole thing actually started, we know that it was a popular tradition among the Lutheran communities in the 17th century Germany. The earliest historical record we have for the Easter rabbit dates back to 1682 in the writings of a German physician named George Frank von Frankenow. He describes several Easter traditions involving rabbits that were common in what is now Western Germany and Eastern France. One interesting thing is that rabbits weren't the only ones delivering Easter eggs back then. Depending on where you were in Germany, people imagined all sorts of animals doing this delivery boy job. In some regions, it was Easter fox, and in others, it was Easter stork. So this definitely wasn't a tradition that started out being all about bunnies. Now, even though we call it the Easter bunny, we are actually talking about hares, not our typical backyard rabbits. This whole tradition went global only in the 18th century when the German immigrants brought this tradition with them to America. But like I mentioned before, you won't find a single mention in history of these rabbits being the sacred symbols of any goddess, let alone Ishtar or Ishtar. And if you do happen to spot a rabbit in ancient iconography, it's definitely not there because it's a sacred animal. For instance, take the statue of Abnoba, an ancient hunting goddess. She is shown with a hunting dog, and that dog is carrying a rabbit. It's pretty obvious that rabbit is not a holy animal. It's just the catch of the day. So if someone tries to tell you that the Easter bunny originated from the goddess of spring, they aren't looking at the facts. They are just repeating the creative imaginations of the 19th century German folklorists. Ancient myths don't mention any goddess with a sacred rabbit, and there is zero proof that rabbits or eggs were part of any pre-Christian spring festival. Even if there was a goddess named Ishtar, she had absolutely nothing to do with Easter bunny. This myth started because of Jacob Grimm's by scholars like Adolf Holzmann. to invent a pagan backstory for a simple folk tradition that we only see recorded after 1682. The bottom line, the claim that Easter bunnies and eggs are part of some pagan fertility cult is a total fabrication. They grew out of Christian practices and local folklore. Anyone falling for these hollow accusations need to take a closer look at history.